Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of Read TFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and update into modern audio standards. This particular story is called The Beasts of Burden, written by Anti-Money Squandering. Grandmother, what have you done? The elven woman, garbed in robes of light green, remained standing at the window and allowed the question to reverberate around the chamber. Once its echoes had been replaced by silence, she turned, beckoning the speaker with one cold hand to join her. Her unlined face remained still, emotionless, but the young elven man knew better and immediately crossed over to join her. Pools of brown so dark they were near black, and he felt almost as if he had been struck. Finally, she averted her gaze, and the younger elf released a breath he had not realized he had been holding. You're lucky, Vanille, that there are none others to hear your churlish outburst. For that reason, I will overlook it, but do not forget who governs here. Of course, Vanille answered, his gaze averted to the wood of the floor. After a moment, he dared to raise his gaze once more, to see his grandmother looking back at him. She sighed, and though there was no sign of it upon her features, he could feel the tiredness emanating from her. I had little choice, grandson. There would be little left to govern if I did not take decisive action. We are a small gathering as it is. We cannot bear any more losses. Vanille opened his mouth before clicking his small, bright white teeth back together, a strong effort to curtail his emotions. His grandmother nodded her approval, and he breathed out deeply, staring past her at the carved window, to the square below. A few elves were dotted around, though most stayed within their homes built within the trees. Although would be focused on the 6 humans who strode through their village, their gait sure, their weapons clearly visible. Hiring humans, though, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. They are little better than animals. He paused, looking back at the elven woman, wary of his words now that it was too late to silence them. To his surprise, she laughed briefly, a light, bright trill that echoed out and floated down the square. One of the humans seemed to pause at the sound before shrugging their burly shoulders and continuing on with their comrades. They are, dear grandson, untouched by magic, shunned by the gods themselves. She finally turned from the window and strode into the room, her gait so light as to make no noise on the hardwood floor. She plucked a bottle from the frosted bowl on the table, poured a generous amount of the strong wine within 2 carved cups. As Vanille joined her, she poured a small measure of iced water into each, before taking a sip of her own. Vanille mimicked her, taking a seat one she deigned to sit herself. But they have uses. Well, they have one use, and it is that use which I have employed these humans for. We don't need some human mercenaries to protect us, Vanille countered as his grandmother sipped at her wine, her slippered foot tapping idly against the chair. We can take care of the centaurs ourselves. Oh, we can? Well, that is good news, dear grandson, she drawled, pouring herself a further measure. Then we have lost half a dozen elves to lure them into a sense of false security. Will you lead the charge, with that fruit peeler upon your hip? A centaur is rather more difficult to skin than a peach, you see. Vanille frowned, though managed to refrain from voicing his anger. His hand unconsciously brushed over the dagger at his hip, an affection he and some other younger elves had adopted, though the rest of the enclave found the display of exposed steel distasteful and boorish. But to have these humans come in and do it for us, it does not sit well with me, grandmother. That is because you are young, Vanille. There is no dishonor in this. This is what humans are for. I've heard of whole wars waged between elf clans, each with a financed human army, and not a drop of our blood spilled. It was civilized approach, and they do it well. Vanille drained his own wine, tucking a few loose strands of black hair behind his long ear. I'm no coward, grandmother. She smiled at that, nodding her head and reaching out to grasp his slim hands in her own. I know that, Vanille, as do the others. But these centaur raiders, they are not worth the risk of your life. The humans will stamp them out swiftly, then be on their way. And if the humans fail, they won't. She leaned back into her seat, pulling an ornate dish of crystal-clear water towards her. And if they do, then the realm has simply lost a few more humans. Why are we doing this, Reeve? Reeve sighed heavily. leaning on his spear against the nearby tree trunk and ignoring the smirk of Gwen, who knelt nearby checking her sword. "Because, Thomas, we need gold. Remember gold? It's the shiny thing you trade for ale." The huge man grumbled under his breath, somehow shrugging off the punch his sister thundered into his shoulder. "Shit jobbers, y'all," Thomas said, throwing a punch back at Lana, who was equally unperturbed as it thudded into her arm. The twins were similar enough in looks as to be confusing, despite their differing sexes. It was not helped by Thomas's penchant for wearing his hair long and bound behind his large head, his sister opting to keep hers shaved close to her skull. The easiest way to tell them apart was in the brutal weapons they carried. A heavier warhammer for him, and an equally solid axe for her. They hefted these now, throwing powerful practice swings into the forest air. "Shit job still pay, Thomas," Reeve answered, unspooling a length of long, tough rope onto the ground. Gwen, her weapon deemed suitable for her purposes and now sheathed, joined him, grabbing one end and moving to tie it around the sturdy trunk. Reeve did the same with his end. Reeve did the same, ensuring it was secure with a few strong tugs. He stabbed his spear into the ground next to it, laying his shield alongside and stretching his limbs out, his hardened leather armor squeaking lightly. "Now everyone get into position. They'll be riding through here soon." "About fucking time," a voice moaned from a tree above, the speaker hidden partly within the foliage. "My arse is falling asleep up here, and I think Van needs a shit." "Shut up and get ready, Sol," Reeve ordered, taking his position crouched behind the tree trunk. Van remained silent as usual, but the glob of spittle descended to the floor from where he was stashed. It was a filthy brown, stained from tobacco that he was endlessly chewing. Gwen mimicked Reeve and squatted by a tree, taking the thick, rough rope in her hands. The twins wandered back behind them, still swinging their weapons, though their complaints had stopped with the promise of work to come. The band lay in wait, some with watchful eyes on the forest ahead, others with their eyes closed. Time passed, Reeve shifting his weight to keep his limbs from going dead. And he paused, hearing what sounded like a whinny in the distance and a low rumble, like far-away thunder. Gwen caught his eye, mouthing over to him, "They're here." He nodded back, gripping the rope himself as the noise grew louder. The herd of centaurs galloping gracefully through the forest, aiming once more for the elven village their tribe had settled near. Eventually Reeve could make out the shapes careening towards them. Over a dozen of the creatures. As they approached, he noted that they were a subspecies of centaur, with a thin stag-like antlers upon their brows, their equine bodies smaller than what he expected. As planned, the herd was running in their general direction, taking roughly the same route as they had always done. He turned slightly and gestured to the twins, who leapt up immediately and bellowed a challenge at the approaching warriors. A few at the head of the herd reared back slightly in surprise at the sudden appearance of two large humans, before the whistling cries of their brethren spurred them on, and they charged as one. The twins stayed still, though their muscles were tense and unreleased energy as a horde descended upon them. As they passed the two large trees that obscured Reeve and Gwen, the two suddenly lifted and tightened the rope as they held, grunting as the weight of the centaurs crashed into it. The front ranks were taken down completely, many shattering ankles and bones, their comrades behind thundering to the floor themselves as they fell over their panicked bodies. The few at the back who were able to stop in time reared up at the sight, bellowing their anger and fear. A few of these were immediately silenced by the whistling shafts of arrows suddenly spouting from their chests and necks, the hands scrabbling for their own weapons going limp. Reeve and Gwen moved as one, spinning around the other side of the trees to face those that had run around the pile of writhing bodies. Reeve thrust out his spear at the nearest, using his own centering momentum to embed the point deep into the furred chest of its lower half, letting go of the weapon as he did so. With a practiced motion he drew his sword, ignoring the baying of the dying creature behind him, and swung his shield heavily into the side of another centaur as it began to trot past. It fell heavily to the floor, kicking out frantically until Reeve's blade snaked down and ripped a bright line across their torso. A third centaur charged towards him, hoping to catch him unaware. This one had managed to unsheath its own long blade, and it whirled it over its head while screaming a war cry. Reeve gripped his shield tightly, positioning himself between the worn metal and throwing himself forward. He used the weight of his body and connected solidly with the front left leg of the centaur. the shield briefly thudding into him painfully from the force, but the loud snap of the limb breaking echoing out. He rolled away before the bulk of the centaur could land on him, jumping up to stamp on its shattered leg. Before it could mount a defense, his sword was buried through its torso, and his eyes scanning the rest of the forest. Gwen had only 2 centaurs to contend with, though both careened towards her at the same time. She ran towards them, a tactic the creatures clearly hadn't anticipated. The frenzied shot one had managed to let loose from its small bow spiraling well clear of her. She targeted this one, throwing her sword towards it. The blade spun through the air, slashing into the chest of the centaur, who reared up in pain, crashing into the floor. The other hesitated slightly, struggling to unsheath its weapon. Before it could do so, Gwen leapt powerfully from the floor, one arm slung around the centaur's torso and gripping its long beard for purchase to seat herself behind it upon its equine back. It reared up to knock the human loose, but Gwen simply tightened her grip, her right hand now slamming a dagger into its chest repeatedly, each thrust of the hilt and followed by a thick spurt of dark blood. As it fell to the ground, she turned to the one she had maimed with her sword, but it was fleeing, its gait uneven as it left a stream of blood in its wake. It had managed to make some ground when an arrow suddenly sprouted between its shoulder blades, sending it thudding to the forest floor. Gwen raised a closed fist in thanks as she ran to retrieve her blade. The twins had heard every stereotype and myth about humans as they barreled into the squirming pile of centaur bodies. They sought to prove them all true. They largely ignored those that had shattered limbs in the initial fall, centaurs usually being incapacitated by a broken leg like their mundane counterparts. Those that struggled to find their footing or tried to press forward to engage were met swiftly with a crunching hammer into their center of mass or an axe embedded into their side. The twins were indiscriminate in their work and barely aimed their huge weapons, content to power blows into portions of flesh that was presented. Skulls were crushed, the antlers splintering apart as the hammer fell while the axe hacked through kicking legs like scything wheat. Throughout this, arrows continued to fly over their heads and thud into the diminishing mass of 4-legged warriors, priority given to those who were attempting to retreat. The remaining centaurs trampled their own as they tried to turn and run back to the safety of the woods, though those that managed it were cut down more brutally by solid blows cracking and splitting their spines and torsos. Reeve and Gwen waded in from the back, stabbing into those still moving until eventually the forest was silent once more, save for the heavy breathing of the humans. Thomas looked down, seeing a small centaurian arrow embedded into the meat of his shoulder. He blew out a guttural sigh and wrenched the implement out, hissing slightly as it came loose. He spat, looking over to Reeve, who was wiping his own blade of center blood. "Shit job," he growled, dropping his hammer unceremoniously onto the skull of a dead centaur. "You're bleeding." Vanille did nothing to hide his revulsion as he stared at the blood trickling from Thomas's wound. The injury itself was insignificant, the centaurian arrow being small, and so he had mostly ignored it. The elf seemed unable to take his eyes from the sight. "It's nothing," Reeve interjected, his own face bearing bruises from the conflict. "Part of the trade." "The trade," Vanille repeated slowly, his gaze still on Thomas. The human towered over him, so his neck was craned upwards. "How, base?" Sel bristled slightly as his words but said nothing. Reeve nodded to her, then turned to Thomas, snapping him on his good shoulder. "Go have your sister bind the wound." Thomas opened his mouth to complain. His hand tightened around the haft of his hammer, still dripping ichor. Before he could, Lana had gripped him, not caring if it was his injured shoulder, and they half wrestled each other away from the square. Vanille seemed to find this even more fascinating. "Brutes," he said, his eyes wide as he saw 2 giants jostle. Gwen frowned now, stepping forward slightly, with one hand upon a pommel of her sword. "What was that, Long-Ear?" she hissed, the elf looking over at her in surprise at being addressed. He looked her up and down briefly, taking in her worn armor and muscled frame. He sucked his teeth sharply and turned from her back to Reeve. "You are the leader." "I am," Reeve said, struggling to keep his tiredness from his voice, both from combat and dealing with elves. "We dealt with the other elf before, the female." "She is indisposed," Vanille answered, waving one pale hand in the air. "What are you called? I'm told your mercenary groups have names. What is it?" Gwen sighed, turning to follow the twins, whose bickering could still be heard clearly in the square. As she walked off, she raised one hand behind, middle finger raised. "The beast's a burden," Reeve answered eventually, his face stoic. He held his gloved hand out. "Payment? Really? I'd have thought it might be something more romantic, or at least dramatic." He looked at the remaining 3 humans and sniffed. "Obviously, I was too optimistic." Reeve's open hand clenched into a fist, and he ground his teeth, repressing the urge to draw steel for the 2nd time that day. Sol stepped forward, walking around the elf and staring at the village, at the homes woven amongst the trees. "Where is everyone?" she asked, leaning close enough that Valine took a step away involuntarily, causing him to almost bump into Reeve. He spun to face him, his face scrunching up as he breathed into the thick odor of sweat and blood. He paled slightly and coughed, though tried to cover it with a hand. "I saw you, you know," he said, his voice tight and hidden behind his palm. "Grandmother scragged you. We saw it. It was chaos. Undignified." "What were you expecting, Elf?" Sol scoffed, walking past him to stand alongside Reeve. "A bard playing to cover the screams, a dash of blood just for flair. Oh, fuck, not honorable combat?" The elf glared at her, though his ears twitched, his eyes falling on the bow that she had stowed on her back. He blinked at it, seemingly lost in the memory. Reeve leaned forward and snapped his fingers loudly in the elf's face. "Pay us the money." Finally, the elf seemed sprung from his reverie, reaching within his tunic to retrieve the soft leather pouch. He hefted it in his palm, seemingly to the verge of saying something more until Reeve growled angrily. Vanille threw the pouch over, and Reeve swiftly stowed it after checking the weight briefly. "You'd think a race as short-lived as yourself would take more care," Vanille began, though his voice wavered slightly as the humans glared back at him. "Take, job's done," Reeve interrupted, turning on his heel and striding from the village. Sol grinned at the elf. "Yeah, fuck off, Elf," she added, before laughing and gripping the arm of Van, who let himself be led wittingly. Though first he threw Reeve the spear, then he waved jauntily at the elf. The 3 humans left, following the trail of their comrades, and the elf could vaguely hear them discussing what to do with the coin. Benil shuddered briefly, his gaze drawn to where the humans had stood, splatters of blood and gore drying into the dirt. He felt a wave of nausea take him, and battled it briefly, furiously aware of the rest of the village were peering at him from their hiding places. He reached down and drew his dagger, the small blade a bright sheen of unblemished steel. He stared at it briefly before tossing it into the mud where the humans had stood, the weapon sinking partially into the soiled ground. "Fucking humans!" End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.